Welcome to the Recess Life Podcast. This is the place where we explore play and what it means to get back to your inner child. I'm Louise, your host. Join me as I chat with teachers, entrepreneurs, artists, and thought leaders about how we can live a life of more play and impact. Let's get it started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2, season 4 of the Recess Life Podcast. I am so glad to be talking to you after a day of blue sky. I know that sounds so weird, but for the past week or so, our sky in the Bay Area has been covered in smoke. And actually, exactly a week ago today, the sun was completely covered for the whole day. There was this orange sepia tone the whole day because the sun just couldn't shine through the smoke and the fog in the Bay Area. It was really disorienting and very, very sad, frankly. If being in a pandemic wasn't already bad enough, now we have to worry about wildfires and smoke. So my heart goes out to those that were directly affected by the wildfires. I'm really grateful that I am safe and healthy and that everyone I know is safe and healthy, but this has definitely been the year that just won't quit. A couple weeks ago, I actually drove my parents out from my hometown in Colorado to move to Sacramento for them to start a new chapter of their lives. My sister and I helped them pack up the remaining boxes they had in our childhood home and drove them out over a course of about 4 days. It was quite the journey to drive them out here, but we made it. They are settled in a temporary spot until they can find a new house to buy. Right as we moved them here, the air got really bad in Sacramento, and part of me was worried that they would regret having moved out here, but the air has since cleared, so I think they are reorienting themselves again. It's really exciting to be seeing my parents in this phase of life where they're excited to start a new chapter. It's hard to remember sometimes that your parents have their own dreams and wishes of their own. It's a good reminder that life has many chapters. Just because you're 30, 40, 50, 60, or even 70 years old, it doesn't mean that life's over. As long as your health is still in order, there is so much life to live. So why not move to a new state? Why not pick up a new hobby? Why not do something interesting and exciting for yourself? This is something that today's guest has a lot to share about. Her name is Laura Nix, and she is a filmmaker and an Oscar-nominated director. Yes, you heard that right. Oscar-nominated as in Academy Awards, as in the most prestigious award you can get for film. This past year, she was nominated for her film Walk, Run, Cha-Cha in the documentary short category. If you haven't seen her film Walk, Run, Cha-Cha, I'm going to link it in today's show notes so that you have no excuse. It is only 20 minutes long and it is so worth your time. The film features Paul and Millie. They are Chinese-Vietnamese refugees who have lived in LA for 40 years. I'm actually going to read Laura's op-ed in the New York Times because it explains the film so much better than I can. If you crossed paths with Paul and Millie Cao, a middle-aged couple who work in California as an engineer and an auditor, you might not guess that every chance they get, they put on sequin-covered costumes and head to a dance floor where they transform into passionate ballroom dancers. That is where I met them 6 years ago when I wandered into Lai Lai Ballroom and Dance Studio. They were part of a group of older Asian Americans dancing the rumba in a room lit like a nightclub in suburban San Gabriel Valley near Los Angeles. I took dance classes at the studio for a year and discovered most of the instructors are professional ballroom dancers from Russia and Eastern Europe. I took dance classes at the studio for a year and discovered most of the instructors are professional ballroom dancers from Russia and Eastern Europe. Almost all their students come from the Asian diaspora, mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Paul and Millie's country of origin, Vietnam. I struggled in waltz classes taught in Mandarin and learned the Taiwanese tango from generous students who offered to show me the steps. Eventually, I became friends with Paul and Millie and their Latin dance teachers, Maxim and Elena. Paul and Millie have been known to practice 4 to 5 nights a week after work, diligently training their bodies for competitions and showcases, where they perform tightly choreographed routines wearing elaborate outfits. I began making this film motivated by the question, what makes these two people so dedicated to dancing? Over time, I learned Paul and Millie's story of fleeing Vietnam as young lovers to come to the United States. Their backstory is both ordinary and extraordinary, representative of many refugees who are forced to rebuild their lives. Creating a new life in America required Paul and Millie to reinvent themselves. While learning how to speak English, they worked multiple jobs, finished their college degrees, took care of their parents while raising a child, and embarked on professional careers. Finding a way to survive defined their adult lives. They didn't have time for the extras. Faced with middle age, Paul and Millie chose to reinvent themselves again. After decades of delayed gratification, this time they focused on what gives them joy. As you'll see in this op-doc, dance opened up a world of self-expression and pleasure for the couple, sparking a transition from responsible professionals to flamboyant performers pursuing their creative dreams. On the face of it, a film about middle-aged people dancing might not seem political. But my decision to tell a story about Paul and Millie's life in the present and not solely focus on their past was intentional. Films about refugees and immigrants are often focused on the point of entry, when the newly arrived are at their most vulnerable. But it's essential for us to hear stories about what happens next. Paul and Millie are refugees from Vietnam. Paul and Millie are also working professionals, parents, dancers, and American citizens who have lived in California for over 40 years. As with many Americans who started their lives in another country, their story embodies resilience and courage, love and longing, separation and reunion. These themes are visually reflected in the dance itself, in their tender glances when he lifts her to the sky, the yearning in their gestures, their ability to transform adversity into beauty. This film connected to me on so many levels because my parents are also immigrants. My father is a refugee from China, and so much of Paul and Millie's story connects to my parents. My parents faced a lot of hardship when they first arrived in this country, and they didn't have time for the extras when we were growing up, just like Paul and Millie. They were working so hard to keep us going as a family that they didn't have time to focus on things that brought them pleasure and joy. They didn't have time to play. Now that my parents aren't in survival mode anymore, they can focus on those things that give them joy. That's a big reason why they have up and moved to a new state to start over, because they can take that risk. My parents can't stop talking about all the hobbies they want to focus on now, like fishing, gardening, exercising, socializing, things that they couldn't really focus on before. This film gave me a deeper appreciation for my parents and for what they've had to go through so that my sister and I could have the lives we have today. The reason why I'm able to talk about play so much is because they've had to endure so much to give me the life that I have today so that I can feel secure enough to do things like play and enjoy myself and do things that bring me joy. So all that to say, I was super excited to talk to Laura. We talked about her process of creating the film, how it really changed her as a person and as a filmmaker. Just a hint. Part of that is that she found her love of dancing again. We talked about what it means to work really, really hard for something that you love. We talked about why Paul and Millie would dedicate 4 to 5 nights of their week to dancing, and what really motivates any of us to dedicate so much time to something. Another hint, it's because it brings us joy and it feels like play. It really was a dream come true to talk to Laura in a lot of ways, so I really hope you enjoy this episode. As always, at the end of the episode, I will come back and share my nuggets of wisdom that I learned from the conversation. I highly recommend watching this film before you listen to this episode, but If you don't, that's okay too. You'll just have to listen to it again. Enjoy this fabulous conversation with Laura Nix. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining me today on The Recess Life. I have been anxiously and excitedly awaiting this day to talk to you ever since I found you on Instagram. And I'm so glad that you've made this time. Like I mentioned just now, the film that you created, Walk, Run, Cha-Cha, which was nominated for an Oscar this past year, it really had an impact on me on so many levels. And I'm just really curious to know a little bit more about your backstory as a filmmaker. Was there a moment where you knew you wanted to be a filmmaker? Was there any moments or people that inspired you to pursue this amazing career that you're working on now?
I didn't set out to be a filmmaker. I was a history major and I studied social sciences. I did study some art, but I didn't go to a school that offered any film classes or media classes at all. Like I had no exposure to it whatsoever. So I always was interested in the medium, but I didn't grow up in a family that went to the movies all the time or anything like that. So it was really something that I started engaging more in as an adult. And there was one time in college when, as a kind of an extracurricular thing, somebody brought this film that Sally Potter made called The Gold Diggers that I saw. Mm-hmm. That was an experimental feminist film. And it was about capital and how I was just so blown away by thinking about how you could talk about ideas using that form. And it just kind of stuck with me. And after I graduated from college, I moved to Boston and I attended a talk by a chapter of Women in Film. And there was a woman there who was an editor who asked me, she was speaking. And at the end of it, I was like, wow, that sounds really interesting what you're doing. She was editing documentary films. She'd also edited fiction films. And I went up to her and I gave her my phone number and I said, if you ever need an apprentice, would you please call me? And she called me 2 weeks later and said, I'm starting a new film and I'm wondering if you'd like to be the apprentice editor. And this was on 16 millimeter when you sat in the room with everybody for hours, like with the film, cutting it with razor blades. And so I started out as an apprentice and then I became an assistant. And that was really how I came up, was through documentary edit rooms. And I didn't become an editor, but I learned a lot about storytelling from just being around people and watching them put a movie together. It was like an invaluable education. In some ways, that was like the beginning of my film school.
Yes. So it sounds like getting immersed in this editor's world was that starting point for you.
I decided I was really interested and I wanted to study more. So I enrolled as a special student at Massachusetts College of Art and studied experimental film for a year. And that kind of blew my mind apart because I was in a more conventional documentary type of filmmaking when I was in the edit room, and going to study experimental film really blew apart the form for me in a really helpful way. And that was when I decided, okay, I think I really want to do this. And so I started making experimental films. And then eventually I moved to San Francisco and I ran the production office of some filmmakers there, Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman. They're really well-known documentary filmmakers. Yeah. And that was like another chapter. I learned so much about how you make a documentary film from beginning to end. They also produce their films and they taught me a lot about producing. And they also taught me it was really important to learn how to do that as an independent filmmaker. That was we made a film called The Celluloid Closet that was on HBO back in the day. And that was when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. So I went to UC San Diego, and I studied film in the visual arts department. So again, I didn't go to film school. I studied film in an art school, which was also a really, invaluable experience. And then I ended up in Los Angeles.
So specifically with Walk, Run, Cha-Cha, how you happened upon the story and how you happened upon the dance studio. I love that story, first of all, of how you found it sort of by accident. But can you share with all of us that story?
Yeah, I was doing research on another project. I was in the San Gabriel Valley, and I was looking at different types of businesses in the area. And when I saw that there was a dance studio, I was really intrigued to go check that out because I'd been looking at all these other businesses in the area. And I just, I found the address and I walked in on a weekday. It was like in the afternoon on a weekday. And I walked in and there was like maybe 40 or 50 people dancing the tango in the middle of the day. They were all Asian and I'd say like middle-aged to seniors. And I just thought, what is this beautiful thing I'm seeing? What is this beautiful place I'm witnessing? And I started taking dance classes there to answer that question. So I enrolled as a student and I took a group class with Max and Elena, who appear in the film, who are Paul and Millie's teachers. And that's how I met Paul and Millie, because they were in that dance class and we became friendly. I was talking to lots of people at the studio and I just was trying to figure out what this place was and how it ran and how it came to be. And what I discovered was that it's a dance studio it's open, every day of the year. They don't even close on Christmas. It's open every single day, basically, I think from like 9 till midnight, something like that. Yeah. And all the teachers are professional ballroom dancers, and they're mostly from your Eastern European background. Not all of them, but most of them are Eastern Europeans, and who kind of have a tradition of ballroom dancing that's different from here. And the students who go to that school are coming from all over the Chinese diaspora. So Paul and Millie are Chinese-Vietnamese and are refugees from Vietnam. Their friends, some of their friends are also Chinese-Vietnamese refugees. Other people are from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from mainland China. So they're just from all over the place. And so the common language in the school is Mandarin. Paul and Millie, when they're with their friends, they speak Cantonese and they speak Cantonese at home. But I mean, other people are speaking Taiwanese, and a lot of the ballroom teachers, they speak Russian with each other. So in the classes, they're either speaking pretty much English or Mandarin, I would say. It seemed like a very perfect world to be able to tell a story about the things that I like best about America when America is working, which is people coming from all these different backgrounds and creating something completely new. And that's the best thing about Los Angeles. That's the best thing about San Gabriel Valley. That's the best thing about so many parts of the country. I mean, there's just so many parts of the country that have that kind of diversity and that have that kind of cultural mix. And I think their dance studio is very typical of that kind of diverse cultural mix. And we can learn a lot from that. And I think it's one of the things that we can celebrate about, any urban area in America.
Mm-hmm. This beautiful collision of cultures coming together to create something new and beautiful.
Yeah. And in this case, you had Eastern Europeans teaching Latin dance to people from the Chinese diaspora in suburban Los Angeles. And that seemed like a great setting for a film and a great way to talk about a lot of issues, right? Not just issues about immigration and cultural diversity, but also about aging and creative aging and how we can all face our later years and the kinds of things that happen in relationships when you've been together for a while. So it allowed the opportunity to talk about a lot of things. And I started, after a year of taking dance classes there, I finally asked Paul and Millie if they would start to let me film them, and they said yes. And then the question changed. Like after I kind of understood more about the place, the new question, because I think you have to start all documentary films with a question. The new question was, why are they dancing so seriously? Like, because it's not just like old people who have found a hobby. There was something else going on that I really needed to understand, because the degree of commitment and passion that they have for it was like on a completely other level. So that was really what set me off to find out more about their story.
what was the answer that you discovered about that question? Because yes, that is something that is very apparent, that this is not just it is a hobby, but it's not just something they take casually. It's something that is deeply important to them.
I absolutely. What I found was that, Paul and Millie are still working full time. He's an engineer and she is an auditor for the state of California. And they leave work every day and basically go to the studio to go practice. And how do people do that, when they have a full-time job? I mean, it completely floored me. I mean, they're going like 5 nights a week and sometimes on weekends as well when they have like a recital or a competition coming up. So it really did need to be answered, this question. I started filming with Paul and Millie about 6 years before we ended up editing the movie. And over that 6 years of time, I really got to know them much better. So we really became friends over time. And I waited a long time to ask them certain questions about when they first came to the country, because I think that you really need to earn the right to ask those questions. And I think that it's better if you have a certain level of intimacy with people before you do that. And eventually I heard the story about how, under what circumstances they left Vietnam and what it was like for them. And, Paul left as a boat person from Vietnam and had a very treacherous journey to be able to come to the United States. He was in a refugee camp in Taiwan for a while. And then he finally ended up in the States. And then he was able to bring Millie. And they were separated for about 6 years. And they were very young when this was all happening. I mean, they were like 19, 21, around that age. And what I started to understand was they had this separation at the beginning of their romance that I think what came clear over time was that they were really making up for the time that they lost.
When Paul and Millie first arrived in the United States, they didn't speak English. They had to really recreate their life from scratch. I think when Paul and Millie got to their early 60s, they had spent their whole adult lives working really hard, building a life, being really focused on a kind of financial stability for themselves and their parents and their daughter and their whole extended family. I think it became clear once they really hit middle age that they were ready to do something for themselves and that they wanted to do something that was pleasurable because they had achieved what they had set out to achieve. And they both were really creative people when they were younger, and there wasn't time in their life to be able to go do something like pursue dance seriously. And so they decided to do that now. And they found that they really loved it, and they found Lai Lai, and they realized that that was a place that they could go in a really structured way and learn and apply themselves completely. And so I think that what we end up seeing is it's two people who had an experience of reinventing themselves by necessity when they were younger. And then as they got older, they reinvented themselves by choice. Mm-hmm. And that to me was just such an inspiring message about basically, how anybody can become an artist and how all those things are within all of us. And we all have the capacity to be able to change and do completely different things with our lives, even as we become older. And they seem such a great example of that. And on top of that, it was really important to me to be able to tell a story about two people coming to the country, but not have it completely focused on their point of entry. I think so many stories about refugees and immigration focus on the point of entry. One of the reasons why I feel like it's really important to not consistently have the story focus on that point of entry is that Paul and Millie have been living in the United States for 40 years. They're Americans, and we don't need to just define them by the moment when they first came here. Now, granted, it was an incredibly formative moment in both of their lives. They were really young people, but they have gone on to become, they went to school, they got degrees, they became working professionals, they had a daughter, they've been living here for 40 years, and then they became dancers. And that is a really interesting story to me. And that was what I wanted to focus on, was this decision that they made at this point in their life to start to become performers, and why they did that and how it's influenced their life and what that looks like. And that seems to me to be another way to speak about immigration. So it's not that it's not part of the story, it's deeply a part of the story, but it's only one part of the story. And that felt very important to be able to have that 360-degree view of who Paul and Millie are.
Showing them as multidimensional and not just this one thing that defines them. And so much of what you said, I can see so much of in my parents. And I see them in this phase of life now where they've worked for so many years, have worked so hard. They've raised 2 daughters who are self-sustaining on their own. And it's like they've gotten to this point of security in their lives where they're able to thrive now on another level. They think about traveling and, they want to move to another part of the country now even though they're in their 60s and 70s now. And one of the most interesting defining moments of seeing my father, actually, a few years ago, I went on a trip with him and my sister to Israel, and he was just the happiest clam, just gallivanting around on this trip with us. And I'd never seen him so happy before, because he was able to, it was almost like seeing the real him, seeing him in this exploratory, childlike sense of wonder. And you can't really get to that place of thriving, I think, until you feel secure and safe. There's a lot of studies done on play and creativity. You're not able to really feel that freedom to play and be creative until you feel a sense of safety in your body, safety in whatever circumstance or environment you're in. What you're saying with this story is so powerful, because I think it's showing that essentially how Paul and Millie are living now, it's because they've gotten themselves to this place where they do feel secure enough to be able to creatively express in this way. And it's so inspiring.
It's well said, what you just said. And I think that that's very true. They speak about it that way too. They did not have the luxury to be exploring things like that when they first got to the US. And even though once they reunited after being apart for 6 years, that is a moment when you'd think that there might be a lot of romance at that moment, right? But that was also squelched because they had to get jobs and work here, and they were working all the time. They were working during the day and going to school at night, or vice versa. And it was many, many years before they felt secure enough to be able to do something just for pleasure, just for fun.
I know for me, even though I have parents who have lived this life that I will still never be able to fully understand. It's so easy for me to even take for granted the sense of security and safety I feel to be able to thrive and take a dance class whenever I want to and be creative and silly, because I have that sense of security that they've given me. Such an important reminder that it's not a given for everyone at all.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
How did doing this film change you and grow you as a filmmaker? I think probably, I imagine all these perspectives that they shared with you, but in terms of how you see people and how you approach filmmaking now, has that changed you in any specific way?
I guess I could just start by how it changed me and then how it changed me as a filmmaker. When I started taking dance classes there, I hadn't taken dance classes in, decades. And it was really hard. It was very difficult to do. And I'm a bit younger than Paul and Millie are. And it was still I just was completely blown away by how in shape everybody was at the studio and how hard everybody worked. And I just felt like this huffing, puffing person. It was very difficult to actually hang in there with the classes. And, I filmed with them for so long, and I made 2 feature-length documentaries during that time that I was filming with them. So I traveled a lot and I was in and out a lot. And Paul used to say to me all the time, you're never going to get good because clearly you don't take this seriously enough. And he was kind of right, actually. And I wandered across the street at one point because the largest Latin nightclub in LA is across the street from their dance school, just coincidentally. Because I would drive by at night and hear the music coming out the doors, and I thought, what's going on over there? I need to go check that out. So I kind of wandered over there, and what is happening at that nightclub is it's a social Latin dance club. So they're dancing salsa and they're dancing bachata, sometimes merengue, but it's really social Latin dance, which is what is danced in the Latino community. And that's a very different Latin dance than what's happening in Latin dance in ballroom. Because the ballroom version of Latin dance is this kind of like Euro version of what Latin dance is, but it's not what happens if you go to like a Latin club and you're going to go dancing at night. It's not, it's like completely different dances, and social dance is improvised and ballroom dancing is choreographed and performed. So it's like memorized as a routine and then you perform it. So I kind of fell into that world and I started dancing again because I was inspired by Paul and Millie. I was loving going to the Latin nightclub, and I had to take a bunch of classes until I could go dancing there because it's quite the learning curve. And I took I was working on a film that I had to edit in New York, and I moved to New York for almost a year. And there was a Latin, like a salsa school in my neighborhood that I started going to, and I got completely into it and became totally obsessed and was taking multiple classes a week. And then I started going out social dancing, and then I was social dancing a bunch of nights a week, and my whole life changed. And I realized, oh my God, I've become like Paul and Millie. Like I got it. I got the story in a really different way than I had understood it before, because I became another middle-aged person who became obsessed with dancing. So it really changed my life a lot to start dancing again. I was happier. I was in better shape. I had like a different outlook on life. And I went back to Los Angeles with this kind of renewed energy to make that film, and kept going with them. But we were always making a feature-length version of the film. And I just kept filming and filming and filming. And I have like a lot of footage from that. And what eventually came clear was, Paul and Millie really like it when I film them dancing. Performers like it when you document them performing. They want to be documented. And it wasn't enough. So, this question of like, why are they dancing? It becomes a much more personal story to be able to really dive into why. And it meant that I really needed to understand more about their backstory. And I needed to understand more about their marriage. And that took a really long time for them to feel comfortable sharing those things with me. And at one point, about 6 years in, the Concordia studio came and said that they were doing this series with the New York Times. And they asked if they'd heard about the project, and they'd seen the proposal for the feature-length version. And they asked if I'd be willing to do a short version of the film that would be part of a series on immigration that was going to be on the New York Times. And we went back and forth about whether or not this made sense, but I felt like it was so important to complete something after filming with Paul and Millie so long. I really wanted to show them that, like, yes, I really do this, and I would really can finish something with you. So that was, when we started filming for the short in particular, and then I could like ask all those questions. And so for me, the film, it's a very personal film to me. The part about what happens when you're middle-aged and how you're going to live your life that's where I'm at in my life. And it raised a bunch of questions about how do I want to face these next years of my life? And they've been a huge inspiration for that. And when I became a kind of middle-aged dancing person, it became even more personal to me. And there's also something about, there's a very universal aspect to this story, which just has to do with marriage. And how do you keep your relationship alive when you've been with somebody for a really long time? And anybody that's been in a long-term committed relationship knows what that means. It's a lot of work, and you have to really remain engaged, and you have to introduce new things into the relationship that you can discover together. And I think that that's a part of the story that anybody can relate to, and it related very deeply to me. So for me, I think it changed me as a filmmaker because I liked making a story that was so personal, and I'd like to continue to make stories that engage me emotionally on that level, not just intellectually, but really emotionally. And I guess also it was a bit of a creative risk to put in this stage dance sequence into the documentary. That's not typically something that would happen in a more conventional documentary. And I always knew that it would work. I knew it would work, but I had a really hard time raising money for the film with this hybrid approach. All my proposals to raise money for the film always had, conventional documentary aspects to it plus stage dance sequences. And people would say, I'm not sure I understand how these two things would go together. I always knew it would work really well. And I stuck by that. And I think that's the other, for me, moving forward, making, bolder decisions about how you want to make this film. It feels really important to me to just like push the formal boundary and really feel confident about doing that, because I'm so glad that we did end up keeping that element of the film. It's essential to what the film is to end it with this beautiful stage dance sequence. And I'm glad that that's a part of it. And it just encourages me to do work like that still.
Yes. It deepened your trust with yourself. It sounds like, to know that, yes, I'm standing by this conviction around putting this dance sequence at the end. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It's breathtaking. Oh, yeah. So it sounds like it really transformed you from the inside out as a person and a filmmaker. You connected with Paul and Millie in a way that you probably didn't expect, and with their story in a way that you didn't set out to do. You didn't set out to become a quote unquote middle-aged dancer yourself. So you mentioned that you hadn't danced in a long time. Did you dance previously for a short time before you decided to give this a shot? What was your relationship with dance before this?
I studied ballet as a young person pretty seriously, and I got to a point, I can't remember exactly how old I was, when it became, I kind of hit like a fork in the road where it was, I would really have to pursue this very seriously, as in like, I want to go become a ballerina or not. It was because I was taking a lot of classes with people who were a lot older than I was, and I was really into it. And then there was like more workshops to go to and more stuff to do. And I think, as a family and as a, I decided not to become a ballerina, basically.
Yeah. Ballet's pretty binary in that way, right? You go down the professional route, or it's hard to do ballet, I guess, casually. I guess you could, but
that's the thing, is that I think that there's so many things that you can pursue casually, but at least when I was doing it, that's not how it was. I mean, you weren't encouraged to pursue things unless you were going to do it really, really, really seriously and be really, really, really good at it. At least that's how I was raised. And I think it's really changed now. I think that now there's much more openness towards, if you want to play music, play music. If you want to dance, dance. Like go, paint, do whatever. You don't have to be the best at it. It's more about the process than it is about the product. But as a, in the 70s and 80s it was not like that. I mean, there wasn't that sense of play, really. There wasn't that sense of just do it because you enjoy it and because it makes you happy. I studied music as well. And I also studied music really seriously. I went to a public high school that had a very advanced music program. It was very unusual. I don't even know if it exists today, but I was able to, I played music probably like 4 hours a day during, like all of middle and high school. And that was hugely formative to be a filmmaker. I mean, I think my music education is it's why I ended up making films. If I didn't, I might be like a print journalist or something. I might be a writer. But because I studied a time-based medium for so long, I was really drawn to working in another time-based medium. And it informs like everything about the way that I approach editing and even storytelling, actually. So it's funny because they're also very much like you shouldn't do it unless you're great at it. Like Paul and Millie are very aspirational that way. Like Paul especially is a total perfectionist. And if he's going to do it, he wants to do it really well, and he wants to compete, and he wants to prove that he's great at it. And, he is just drawn to doing something the best that you can possibly do it. And Millie's more relaxed about all of that than he is.
You can tell.
Yeah, he's really like that. So it was also, it was inspiring to be around people who just took it seriously. It's like, okay, yeah, we don't have anything to prove here, but we're going to really give it our all. And that was, that's the way that I approach many things in my life too. And I think that, three of us share that in common, that when we do it, we want to do it really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I talk about this concept of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Mm-hmm. And when we are motivated by sort of external ideas of what success or what good is, what someone tells you is good, that works to a certain degree, I think. But then after a while, if you're using that to constantly motivate yourself, it starts to drain you. But if you intrinsically motivate yourself and decide, I want to be great because this is the standard I want to set for myself, and I am intrinsically motivated because it brings me joy, that is much more sustaining. And that's what play is to me. That's what creativity is about. It's that internal desire to really be great, despite what anything outside of you is telling yourself. So,
and that's what dance is so great at doing, right? When you are dancing, you lose yourself. You completely go into another zone of being where you're just a body in motion and you're expressing yourself in relation to music. And it's a feeling of euphoria, and it can be a feeling of joy. And I mean, everybody who dances speaks about this. And this is one of the reasons why I included the stage dance sequence, is that I wanted the audience to have a view into how Paul and Millie feel when they're dancing. So, if you looked at me dancing, I'm not a great dancer. Okay. I mean, I'm okay, but I'm certainly not great at it. But I feel great when I'm doing it. Right. So the way I feel when I'm dancing, I feel like I'm some fabulous person dancing. Right. But when you look at me, I just look like whoever dancing. And I think that where it takes you in your brain and is why people are so drawn to it and why people pursue it as seriously as they do, even if they're not professionals.
Yeah. It's like, I get so discouraged when people say, oh, I just don't dance. And I'm like, we're all born moving and grooving to music. Yeah. It's just, again, when external factors come into play and we use those to judge ourselves, that's when we lose the drive or desire to do it. Is there anything you wish you would have done differently for the film? You said you were super convicted around putting that dance sequence in, which is great. And you mentioned the feature length, that you were working on a feature length, but is there anything that you wish you would have done differently with this short length documentary that is out now?
I mean, look, filmmakers, we're greedy people. We always want more, right? So I really do wish that several years ago that I'd been able to raise more money and make the feature length version of the documentary, because I have so much more footage that's really beautiful. And if I had been able to raise more money, we would have been able to have done several stage dance sequences and, really expand the story, because the bones are there, but I know how much more material there is. And I know so many other aspects of their story that I'd like to include. But sometimes things happen for a reason. And the way in which, because I did not raise money quickly, I had to spend much more time at the studio and with Paul and Millie, 7 years. And that is invaluable. So when you get to know people over that length of time, you're able to tell a deeper story. So in some ways, it ended up working out because I think I was able to get to a more personal angle on their story that I wouldn't have if I had raised the money. I never would have gotten there. And I think the whole thing would have been more superficial and kind of more about dancing and aging and not so much about their personal story. So there is a benefit to the length of time that it ended up taking. And since we finished the film, I've had a number of producers approach me about doing a fictional version of Paul and Millie's story, which I'm really interested in. And I'm having conversations about that now. And if I had gotten what I wanted earlier on, I wouldn't be here at this moment because I would have just made that and we wouldn't have this opportunity. So I do think that, even though you want something to work a certain way, sometimes things can just surprise you and you can end up someplace completely different. It's a happy accident.
That's such a metaphor for life, right? We sometimes get into this idea or attachment of how things are supposed to look or how they're supposed to be. But then when there's an acceptance, it actually all works out the way it's supposed to work out in the end. That would be an incredible film to see a fictionalized version of that. Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah, I always think of it if I really hope we're able to do it. And if we do, I always feel like it would be the real La La Land.
Yes. I'm already seeing you at the Oscars for this one. I'm going to get ahead of myself for you. How do you personally balance the emotional ups and downs of being in a creative field? Because it is such an unconventional route to take in a career. And there are so many, like you said, raise money for a project and reroute a project when it goes in a different direction. How do you personally deal with that on either a day-to-day level or just sort of a big picture perspective? No pun intended.
I think that being an independent filmmaker it's a really challenging vocation. It's incredibly rewarding. I feel unbelievably lucky to get to do the work that I do and to be able to go all over the world and meet people and film them and be able to step into another world that's not mine and work to the point where you have access to people and to a subject matter to be able to dig in and ask questions. I mean, it's a dream. I mean, it's an incredible thing to be able to do. And I feel unbelievably lucky to be able to do it. I feel quite privileged to be able to do it. I am privileged to be able to do it. But it's hard. And, I don't think if I understood how hard it was when I began, I don't know if I would have chosen this line of work. I really don't know. It's just very, it's very unsustainable. First of all, it's very hard to make a living doing this kind of work. I don't come from a family that, supports me. And I did not grow up with some trust fund that is buffeting all of this. When you talk to a lot of documentary filmmakers, that's actually the case. So it's very difficult to make ends meet. And it's also very difficult to, have any kind of work-life balance. And I can't say that I personally have conquered that. I still don't have a very good work-life balance. I work all the time. And the only way I'm able to do that is just because I've become very careful about what projects I work on. And they take so long to make, and they are so difficult to kind of hang in there during the rough times that you really, really, really have to love it. You have to love the subject matter. You have to be willing to live that subject matter.
Has to be worth it.
Has to be worth it. It has to be personal to you. You have to be passionate about it. And if you're not, it's just not going to work. It's just not worth the time because, it's every day, something comes up where, you're really tired and you want to stop and you just can't, because it's like you have to push through, like getting through another 2-3 hours of work that day. And if you are not able to do that, you're not going to be able to finish your movie. There's it takes another level of commitment and passion, I think, to be able to do this kind of thing. So my way of coping is just choosing the right things to work on and really making sure that I'm deeply committed to them, because that's the only way I know how to get through the process.
Mm-hmm. It's the only way you know how to stick with it, because you believe in it that much. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And wouldn't we all rather be working so hard for something we believe in, right? Rather than, something that just gives us a paycheck every day. I mean, I guess that's the way I see it.
When I talk to young people who are thinking about doing this, I really try and drive that home, which is that, from the outside, this might look really cool to go do this kind of work, but the reality of the slog of what it means to do this work is a really, really different story. And it's not a grown-up life. You don't get to do things that other people around you are doing. You just don't. And you have to be you have to be very, very committed to it, because you're not going to be able to like go take the vacations or, improve something on where you live, or, even like show up for people sometimes the way that you want to. I think it changes everything about how you can exist as a human in the world, because it's just such an unbelievable amount of work. And certainly I should also say that some people are much better at balancing it than I am. That's how I work. That's how I do it. But I do think it's important to kind of know that before you embark on doing this thing. And I did have a couple people at the very beginning warn me about how difficult it would be, and especially how difficult it would be for women. And I think that that's been true. And I really respect that and appreciate that people were honest with me about that, because when things got really tough, I just reminded myself, oh, this is what they meant. When they said it was going to be really, really, really hard, this is what they meant. This moment when I'm totally ready to throw in the towel, and I can't. So I'm not going to. I'm going to keep going, but this is what the difficulty looks like.
Mm-hmm. Thank goodness they didn't sugarcoat it, right? And you're not doing that either with people you talk to. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to talk to young people very honestly about what it means to choose a life in the arts.
This is the reality, not to say that you shouldn't do it, but this is what you might be faced with. If someone is not working in a creative field, what's one way they may be able to think about creativity for themselves? People in my life who feel like that creativity is just not something that is in their DNA. Is there anything that you can speak to about someone that feels that way about themselves when it comes to creativity?
I think one thing that happens around the discussions of creativity is that I think it's overly focused on the arts, and it shouldn't be, because engineers are creative, computer scientists are creative, scientists are creative. There's you could be a historian and be creative, or a sociologist or something, an economist. There's creativity relies so much on curiosity. And for me, that's where it really starts, is being, open to information and knowledge and perspectives that you don't already have.
Yeah.
So it's about cracking your world open. And that could be, deciding to be an avid reader. You could just be somebody who decides to take in more music, or take in more novels, or whatever it's going to be for you. Go to watch performance. There's so many different ways that you can kind of have the other people's creativity influence you. And I think that that's really where it begins, is just being open to new experiences and new information, and and new ways of being. And if you're able to do that, you're going to find yourself be changed over time. That's what I would say and to really think about how you are able to create in your own life, because it doesn't need to be like, oh, I decided to paint something. It could be that, you decide you're going to learn about one kind of cuisine and you're going to like go to the store and go find new ingredients that you've never had before and go make something that you've never had before and cook something incredible in your kitchen that you taught yourself how to do, and that is just as much of a creative experience as anything else is. So I think it's really important for us to just expand this notion of what we mean by being creative and what the product of creativity can look like.
It doesn't have to be confined to, a professional product or a career necessarily at all.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be related to the arts either. I think it's really, really important to just remember that you can find creativity absolutely anywhere, and we do. And so it's also like, look around your life for where you think you see, look around your life for what creativity looks like to you.
Yeah, just the life that you have right now. You don't have to make some big, massive change. What is next for you? I know you must have a million projects in the pipeline. Do you have anything that's being released soon? Anything we can look forward to?
I'm just finishing a short film about a group of refugees from the Congo who were all survivors of torture and trauma and who were relocated to Salt Lake City. Wow. And once they arrived, it wasn't like their problems ended immediately. They started experiencing a lot of mental health issues, and they started a women's knitting group where they could all be together. And the act of knitting and being together like just transformed everybody's lives. So it's really a film about how people became socially isolated after all the women in the film had lived in a more communal arrangement earlier, and then they came to the United States and they were living in like these single family homes away from everybody, and it just had a huge effect on their mental health. And once they were able to be with each other and make things again, their lives just radically transformed. So it's really about self-healing and how community can also be an element of healing, and creating community for yourself and finding solace in community and in communication with others. And it was really a great project to work on. I filmed it in the fall and we just delivered it this week.
Oh my goodness. Incredible. So it's going to be going around to festivals and distributed other places?
It's part of a series called Take Care, and it's about holistic health approaches. And then I've got a couple longer feature-length films that are in development. They're not really ready to talk about yet, but I can just say briefly that like one of them is about photography. Then I'm also working really earnestly on the feature-length version of Paul and Millie's story, whether that's a documentary or fiction, or perhaps a hybrid that would be a mix of the two, combining nonfiction and fictional elements.
And I know people can follow you on Instagram. And is it Felt Films? That's your website?
Feltfilms.com is my website. And on Instagram, I'm at Nix Laura. And on Twitter, I'm at Felt Films.
Okay, perfect. I'll be sure to link people to those places they can find out more about you. I have a couple fun rapid fire questions. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I wanted to be a journalist when I was growing up. That's what I thought I was going to be. I thought I was going to be a journalist.
If you could have any superpower in the world, what would it be?
If I could have any superpower, it would be to have a really beautiful voice. I always wished I could sing.
Who are your play or creativity idols? Anyone you look up to in particular?
I mean, I look up to musicians, so I think about people like Miles Davis and Prince. Those are my muses in a way, you know, the people who I think of as kind of being like the ultimate in creative expression.
I visited Prince's Paisley Park in Minneapolis just this last fall. Oh my goodness. It is.
To go. I have to
You
make
need to.
a pilgrimage.
It is incredible. You get to see his outfits from his stage performances, all the sound stages where he threw parties and performances. It is just an incredible place. Please do it. And lastly, if you could say anything to your inner child or your 10-year-old self, what would it be? Little Laura.
Little Laura, I think I would just say to like, I don't know, it's funny. It's like really actually take pleasure in playing and take pleasure and solace in creating imagined worlds and trust those imagined worlds and trust those fantasies and just feel empowered to dig deeper into the dreams.
That needs to go on a quote board. Thank you for sharing that, Laura.
I really, really appreciated it. It was really very, very thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful answers.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with the amazing Laura Nix. I feel so lucky to have had that conversation with her. I am so inspired by her as an artist, a creative, and just as someone who learned and grew such wisdom from her experience of making the film. I have so many reflections from our conversation, so let's just dive right in. I love the way Laura happened upon Paul and Millie and the dance studio and how she ultimately ended up making the film. She wandered into the dance studio one day just out of pure curiosity. And out of pure curiosity, she started taking dance classes there and started to get to know Paul and Millie and the dance instructors and the other students of the studio. And it's her curiosity that led her to ultimately making the film. She had a hunch that she needed to walk into the studio that day. And if she wouldn't have listened to that hunch, she would have never made the film and maybe would have never been nominated for an Oscar. It's just so when I hear stories like that, it's such a reminder that we need to follow the hunches that we get and those little voices that tell us to follow our curiosity. You never know where it's going to lead you. I love that Laura's journey paralleled Paul and Millie's story in a lot of ways. She rediscovered her love of dance through doing the film. She became what she calls herself, a middle-aged dancing person that started taking classes and going to social dances at clubs. Doing the film helped her to rediscover her joy of dance again. Paul and Millie wouldn't be in this place in their life if they haven't built up enough security and foundation for themselves to experience this type of joy. They've worked so hard to get themselves to a place of security in their life that they're now able to focus on something that brings them joy. But getting to this place in life is not a given for everyone. And for those of us that are lucky enough to have our basic needs met and to have capacity to enjoy things that are purely for the joy of it, we should be really grateful for that. If you happen to have the space, time, and resources to enjoy those things that give you joy, take advantage of it because not everyone has that luxury. And be so grateful that you have that capacity to do so. My parents are able to enjoy that phase of life now because they are retired. But if you don't have to wait until retirement, take advantage of this time now. If you have the capacity to experience joy, why would you delay it a single day? In the conversation, we talked about the concept of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the motivation that causes us to work so hard at something, but to love it at the same time. It's our ability to engage in something so fully that we lose track of time. Intrinsic motivation is what happens when you are fully playing. Intrinsic motivation is what happens when we are so excited to give our full time and attention to something. Paul and Millie are completely intrinsically motivated to dance as much as they do. They don't have to be told to be at the dance studio 5 days a week. They do it willingly. Do you have anything that you feel that motivated by? Once you discover what that is for yourself, you're going to experience so many more levels of joy that you didn't know were possible. If Paul and Millie found it, so can you. Do what Laura did and follow your curiosity and you'll find it. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is motivation that comes from something outside of ourselves. This could come from another person, society, culture, your family, friends, work, your boss. Extrinsic motivation is not bad, but it's not exactly inspiring. If you're constantly doing things out of extrinsic motivation, it's eventually going to drain the energy out of you or make you resentful. We can't operate on others' will. We have to do it for ourselves. The energy that sustains us is the one that we give ourselves. And if we operate from extrinsic motivation too much, we lose touch with ourselves. I'm so glad that this film exists for everyone to enjoy. Make sure you watch the film if you haven't yet. You can find it on the show notes from this episode at therecesslife.com, or you can go on YouTube and search for Walk, Run, Cha-Cha. I'll be sure to include some resources and links about Laura that you can find on the show notes as well. There's not a lot of stories shared about the Asian refugee and immigrant experience, so I'm so grateful that this documentary exists, and I'm so grateful to Laura for taking the time to make such an impactful film. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode. If any of this episode resonated with you in any way, please shoot me a DM on Instagram and be sure to leave a review on iTunes for the podcast. It really helps others to find it, so I would so appreciate that. I'll see you next time. Are you looking for more play in your life? Make sure you're subscribed to the Recess Life podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or any of the podcast platforms. You can also find the video interviews on YouTube. Don't forget to leave a review. Your feedback is so important to me, and it helps others to find the podcast. You can also follow the conversation on Instagram at therecesslife. And lastly, you can go to therecesslife.com where you'll find all the episodes and show notes on each of our guests. I hope this podcast helps you to become a little more playful today than you were yesterday. Until next time, don't forget to get out and play today.